This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, well, very good evening to everybody, and a warm welcome to this seminar on a cold and rainy night. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Cantor. I'm the Director of the Refugee Law Initiative. This is a series of seminars which is dedicated to international refugee law. And this year we have a particular focus looking at different regional setups, different regions of the world, the refugee protection issues there, and the kinds of problems that arise in law and in practice in trying to address some of those problems. For those of you at the back, I think we are bringing in a couple more chairs, so if you just bear with us, we should have them with you in a couple of minutes. We're very fortunate, having heard in previous months about situations in Latin America, in Europe and in Africa, to have somebody today who's really an expert on refugees in the Middle East, and particularly on the issue of Palestine refugees in the Middle East. I'm not going to say too much more about the topic, other than to say the topic is, as you should all know, refugee protection in the Middle East, and the role of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. And to save us saying that mouthful many times, it's commonly referred to as UNRWA. So just to very briefly introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, Anna Segall is a human rights lawyer with 25 years' experience in international organisations, including the International Committee for the Red Cross, the United Nations, government and private sectors, advising on a whole range of issues. She's currently the Director of Legal Affairs at UNRWA, and also, since last year, the Acting Director of Operations in Jordan. So someone who I'm sure will be able to address not only the legal side of questions, but also some of the practical and operational ones insofar as they arise. The seminar itself will be a 40 to 50-minute presentation by Anna, after which we'll have time for all of your questions and comments. So if you can please leave those to the end, I'd be very much grateful. And with that, I'll hand over to Anna. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, it's very nice. Tell me if you can't hear and tell me if I talk too fast. It's very nice to be here and to see you all. I want to give you a brief outline of what I was planning to talk about. I'm probably going to do it slightly from a field operational political practitioner's perspective rather than a legal perspective. But I'll try and mix them in a bit together, because I think in the Middle East all of those mix together. I wanted to talk a little bit about UNRWA, a little bit about its history and its mandate, and then how the mandates of UNRWA and UNHCR sit together. Alicia is here from UNHCR, so if there are any specific UNHCR questions, Alicia will be able to answer them. I also wanted to talk about UNRWA's protection work, how it's developed over the last 7 or 8 years. I wanted to talk about the way in which UNRWA, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, has increased our engagement with the international human rights system. I want to talk about the current protection challenges for Palestine refugees in the 5 fields of operation where UNRWA works in the Middle East. And then I wanted to talk also about what happens to Palestine refugees outside of our fields of operation. I also thought it might be interesting, but we'll see how the timing goes, to talk a little bit about the use of international law in humanitarian advocacy, because I think it's an issue that's quite important for those of you who are in the human rights world. And then, depending how we're going, a little bit specifically on the effect of the Syria crisis for our operations in the region. Another thing that I think is quite interesting, but we might not get onto it, is what Palestinian statehood has meant or might mean for protection of Palestine refugees and issues about citizenship. I think there are quite a lot of questions that are still out there. They're quite vexed, they're quite difficult, they're not getting a lot of attention, and I don't think they're getting very clever attention, which I think will have protection consequences for Palestinians as well. So that's by way of an introduction. I've been at UNRWA now for just over 7 years. I started out as Chief of the International Law Division. For the last 4 or 5 years I've been Director of the Legal Department, which does quite a lot of stuff other than international law. It also does a whole lot of managing UNRWA's privileges and immunities, contract and procurements, employment and industrial relations law, I think we do 8,000 contracts a year and we have 30,000 staff. So there's quite a lot of ordinary company corporate business that goes on, as well as the international law elements that we'll be more focusing on today. Most of you, I assume, have heard of UNRWA, are a little bit familiar with it and its work? Yeah. Perfect. So as you know, UNRWA has been actually in operation working since 1950. It was established as a result of the exodus of Palestinians from what was then about to become Israel, Mandate Palestine, from the 48 conflict, when there were some 700,000 Palestinians who left the area and moved quite widely in the area. So we have field operations in Jordan, Gaza, the West Bank, Syria and Lebanon, where we provide services to a population of some 5 million Palestine refugees. So in the beginning there were 700,000, there's now 5 million. The definition of Palestine refugees, as you'll probably mostly know also, I can't see you and my paper at the same time. It's those who were resident in Palestine between 1st of June 1946 and 15th of May 1948, and who then, as a result of the conflict, left and lost both their homes and their livelihoods. That's not quite a legal definition. The definition that has been used over time has never been formally adopted by the General Assembly or anybody else. That's our operational definition, which we have used since 1984. It's generally accepted. We don't get too much problems with it. What you also need to know is that Palestine refugees also include descendants of those who were originally Palestine refugees. And what you also need to know, and which is now clear on our website but wasn't when I arrived at UNRWA in 2007, it in fact only goes through the mail line. That's not an UNRWA choice. That is a choice that reflects the way citizenship is passed down in the region generally. It's had some consequences for the way that we work. It's had some consequences for the access to services of women who are Palestine refugees themselves and who are married to non-refugees. So we have 30,000 staff. We provide health, education, social services, social work, safety net, a microfinance program, camp infrastructure, an improvement program, and then increasingly, and I think increasingly explicitly, response to emergencies, and increasingly explicitly and increasingly properly staffed, fortunately, a protection function. If you're wanting to have a big picture of what it is that we do, the best place to get that is from our annual reports that the Commissioner General submits to the General Assembly once a year. UNRWA is a slightly odd bit of the United Nations. It's odd in a number of ways. It's odd in being a subsidiary organ of the UN that reports directly to the General Assembly. There are only two. At first, when I first joined UNRWA, I thought there was only one, but I subsequently realised there's another one. It's called UNIDIR, which is the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. So we're the only two that report directly into the General Assembly. It's not clear to me why that is, why we are, why they are, why we both are. The budget of UNRWA, just to continue with some general information, it's about 1.2 billion. Unlike most of the UN, we are a so-called voluntarily funded agency, which in fundraising terms is a catastrophe, because it's much better to be an obligatorily funded agency, obviously. So we have, over the last 5 to 10 years, every year at about October, significant concerns about whether we're going to actually meet our salary budget for the 30,000 staff. This year it wasn't clear until the 18th of December that we were going to be able to pay the staff their December salaries. So we actually had to push back payment of December salaries So the bulk of our funding, I mean, the biggest donors are US State Department, Bureau of Population, Refugee and Migration, European Union, and DFID. And then there are quite a lot of the Swedes, the Australians, and quite a lot of others give significant amount of funds. We're trying to increase the amount of funding we get from Arab donors. We've had some success, but for a variety of reasons it's quite difficult, partly because the problem is perceived as a problem created by European governments, and partly because by and large Arab donors prefer to contribute to objects than our general operating fund, and most of our work is our staff costs. I mean, a good 90% of our money is our staff costs, because if you're providing schools and health clinics, what you need is staff, essentially. So about 30,000 staff, over 20,000 are teachers, and probably of the remaining 10,000, probably over half of them would be medical staff of one sort or another. So that's UNRWA in a very brief overview. The way UNRWA is structured, we do 6-year medium-term strategies, and then we do 2-year biennium plans, and then we do 1-year implementation plans. Once you've started working for bureaucracies, you'll realise that most of your life is spent doing planning and then reviewing the planning, and it's pretty tedious. But what's encouraging is, having been in on the preparation of the medium-term strategy for this 6-year period, 2010 to 2005, we've started already looking at the next medium-term strategy, 16 to 21, and it's clear how much more confident we are and will be in talking about our protection mandate, and in talking about some of the protection difficulties and structural legal difficulties facing Palestinians in our 5 fields of operation. So it's not always, when you're working in a big bureaucracy, that you get to see significant progress, but I think UNRWA has made significant progress in the way in which it conceives its work and the support and assistance and protection that it needs to provide to Palestine refugees. So the other thing that's a bit eccentric about UNRWA is that it's a temporary agency that's existed for, I think, now 64 years. Our mandate is renewed every 3 years. It's due for renewal again next year. It will continue to have its mandate renewed until there's a durable and lasting solution to the position of Palestine refugees. So at the moment, you know, we'll keep our eye on what's happening with the current negotiations in the Middle East, but we've also looked at a lot of negotiations in the last period. So UNRWA will be there providing services to Palestine refugees for the time that we're needed to do that. Now, in addition to providing services to Palestine refugees, defined as I defined them before, we have also been asked over time by successive General Assembly resolutions to also provide support and assistance, but essentially humanitarian emergency response assistance as and when necessary, for the period that it's necessary for serious humanitarian needs, to those who have been displaced as a result of conflict. So that's relevant for the 67 displaced. It was relevant also during the 2006 Lebanon war. It was to some extent relevant during the Gaza conflict, but they weren't really able to be displaced much because of the blockade. And it's increasingly and most significantly relevant, I think, now with the current crisis in Syria. Now, I think the other thing that's important, if you look at some of those documents, one of the things that's quite interesting is we've structured it against 4 human development goals. So we see our task as providing a long and healthy life, which supports our health program, acquired knowledge and skills, which supports our education program, which is both primary and secondary education, and then also some tertiary vocational education. It's decent standard of living, which supports the microfinance work that we do, and it supports some of the work of the Relief and Social Services Department. And then it's also human rights enjoyed to the fullest, which supports a lot of the protection work that we do, and also the care that we take in the way in which we furnish services ourselves. Because one of the things that's quite interesting about UNRWA, and it's another oddity about it as an organisation, is unlike much of the UN, we're a direct service provider. So a lot of UN agencies will be helping government do the work that they should be doing better. UNRWA actually provides, in many ways like a governmental organisation, governmental services, which is quite interesting in employment law terms. And just recently we've come out of a 2-month strike of our 7,000 staff in the West Bank, based on issues about pay. And so then there's whole questions about, well, what's the relevant comparator? And so we're governmental, so the relevant comparator for us is the governmental equivalent, providing equivalent services. So in some ways we're quite different from the United Nations, and then we have to make extra special efforts to make sure that our operations work in UN ways. Now, the way in which, if you like, UNRWA and UNHCR have divided the world of refugees. UNRWA was established before UNHCR. We were set up by virtue of a General Assembly resolution in 1949, and we started operations in May 1950. UNHCR was established, you know, given the negotiations of the 1951 Refugee Convention and pursuant to a statute. And was operational from 1951. Now, another oddity about UNRWA is that we don't have a constituent document or a statute, like, say, World Health Organization or UNHCR. So when you're looking at what our mandate is, and when I first arrived at UNRWA in 2007, there was a lot of arguing about what UNRWA's mandate includes. But our mandate, you have to go and look at General Assembly resolutions, essentially since the beginning of the time UNRWA was established until now. When I arrived at UNRWA in 2007, the discourse, there were two elements of a discourse about UNRWA, which I think we have managed to now thoroughly knock on the head. The first is that UNRWA doesn't have a mandate to do protection. And the second is that there's a protection gap and that nobody's providing protection for Palestine refugees. Now, part of the way we knocked on the head the argument that we don't have a mandate to do protection was by a very careful analysis of UNRWA's mandate that I think you may have had seen already, which is an article by a colleague of mine, Lance Bartholomew's, on UNRWA's mandate at 60. And he essentially looked through the resolutions since UNRWA was established. We have 4 resolutions a year, one about our operations, one about assistance to refugees, one about the budget, and one about the 67 and subsequent displaced. So he went through all of those, and he also went through all of our annual reports on the basis that what has been talked about in an annual report that has been submitted to the General Assembly and subsequently endorsed or noted by the General Assembly is therefore tacit endorsement of that which we have been doing. And by force of saying that significantly, it works. And it's now accepted that we have a protection mandate. We also succeeded, I think, in 2010. I mean, there had already been mentions and references to UNRWA's protection work. I think the earliest was in about 1982 when we first had a sort of refugee support protection program. But the strongest and most explicit reference to protection was in a 2010 General Assembly resolution talking about our human development work and our protection work, and specifically recognising, thanking, commending sort of language. So we don't any longer have the concern about us having a mandate gap. From time to time, we still get concerns expressed about whether there's any protection being done for Palestine refugees. I was recently, last year, there was meeting of human rights NGOs in the Middle East and North Africa, and one of the participants launched a very violent attack on UNRWA for A, not doing protection, and B, not taking new registrations of Palestine refugees on our books. So it was quite nice, with the confidence of having moved that debate forwards, to be able to say, no, we have a mandate, yes, we provide protection, and thirdly, if people who meet our operational definition of a Palestine refugee come to us to be registered and they have the adequate documentation, then they can be registered. So coming back to the question of what does UNRWA do and what does UNHCR do, the Refugee Convention, when it was crafted, was very cleverly crafted to deal with the fact that UNRWA already existed and was providing support to Palestine refugees. So there's a very good note on Article 1D, which is the relevant provision in the Refugee Convention, which explains how UNRWA and UNHCR's mandate separate. Essentially, I'm very bad at Article 1D. For me, it's a bit like time differences and exchange rates. It's one of those things I can't do. But anyway, what happens is, under the first paragraph of Article 1D, there's an exclusion clause. So a refugee who is receiving protection or assistance from another UN agency is excluded from the benefit of the 1951 Convention. So if you're a Palestine refugee and you're in one of our 5 fields of operations, then you are receiving protection, or can, and that amounts to the same, protection or assistance from UNRWA, and therefore you are excluded from UNHCR's mandate and you come into UNRWA's mandate. It gets slightly more complicated because there's a second paragraph to Article 1D, and that's an inclusion clause. So you get excluded if you're a Palestine refugee in the 5 fields of operation, but you can be included if you're a Palestine refugee within the meaning of the operational definition that I referred to earlier, but you have ceased to receive protection or assistance from UNRWA for any reason. Which essentially means, in the case in which it's most relevant and applicable, if you're not in UNRWA's 5 fields of operation, you won't be receiving protection or assistance from UNRWA, and therefore you will ipso facto be entitled to the benefits of the 1951 Convention, and be your port of call is UNHCR. There could be other reasons. I mean, if peace were to break out and UNRWA were to be dismantled, that would also be cease for any reason to exist, and UNHCR would take over protection work for refugees. Now, the other distinction, in a way, UNRWA and UNHCR do rather different work. UNHCR has, I mean, you'll all know this better than I probably, there's the whole of the barrel of protection work that it does, and then there's the whole barrel of repatriation, resettlement, local integration. UNRWA, based on the reasons for its establishment and the basis of its establishment and the notion that a durable and lasting solution would include return of Palestine refugees, UNRWA doesn't have a return, resettlement, local integration mandate. And this brings me, I think, to one of the difficulties that Palestine refugees face in the 5 fields of operation where we do work. The extent to which they are and can be and have been successfully integrated into the life of the places in which they're living. I mean, we can put Gaza and West Bank aside because that functions and it's Palestine in a sense. But if you look at the situation in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, it's quite difficult from a protection perspective. I'll come to Syria afterwards, but it used to be okay for Palestine refugees in Syria. They used to be treated in much the same way as Syrians. So there'd be some human rights questions that you might have there. But in terms of equality of treatment, Palestinians were not citizens, but pretty much treated on equal footing with Syrians. In Jordan and Lebanon, that is far from being the case. There are a range of professions that Palestinians in Lebanon are not allowed to exercise. Most of the professions, Palestinians are not able to access the professions, they're not able to become members of the professional bodies, and they're not able to work in those fields at all. There's also significant limitations on property ownership. And obviously they're not citizens. In Jordan, it's a little more complicated and it's quite interesting, and having spent a 6-month period as Director of Operations in Jordan, it's become something a bit clearer to me, and also something where I think the Jordan Field Office will be expanding its work. Many of the Palestine refugees in Jordan actually have Jordanian citizenship. The majority of them, the bulk of them. The bulk of those that don't are the ex-Gazans. So those Palestinians who would have been from the West Bank, which at the time Jordan had, the West Bank was part of Jordan, they mostly have Jordanian citizenship. So those who have the hardest time in Jordan are very much the ex-Gazans who don't have citizenship, who, like the Palestinians in Lebanon, are significantly limited in terms of access to the labour market and access to professions and access to all sorts of odd things like public driving licences, which means you couldn't be a taxi driver either. There's a particular refugee camp not far from Amman, about an hour away probably, which is called Jerash or Gaza camp, where the vast majority of the population is ex-Gazan, and that's by far the poorest group of the population within Jordan. Another problem that we have had in Jordan is one that we haven't quite been able to get to the bottom of. It's a number of Palestinians with Jordanian citizenship being at some point denationalised. I think that's no longer happening. We haven't seen it for 3 or 4 years. We don't quite know why it's no longer happening. We don't know if that means it won't happen again. And then in Lebanon, there's a similar problem with people who don't have proper ID documents, who have even more significant barriers to access to anything than those who are simply subject to the ordinary barriers that Palestinians face in terms of access to the labour market and the property market. Now there's a further dynamic now that cuts in with the situation in Syria. I wanted to give you a picture of the refugee flows out of Syria, because I think it's, I'm still shocked by what is happening in Syria, that people are starving in Syria in what was a relatively wealthy country 3 years ago. I still haven't come to grips with it. The international community hasn't come to grips with it at all. But if you look at the population of Syria and you look at the population of Palestine refugees in Syria, it's about a population of about 22 million, and a Palestine refugee population, those who are registered with us in any event, of about 500,000. Now, of the 500,000 Palestine refugees in Syria, more than half of them are now displaced. So 250,000 Palestine refugees are displaced. About 170,000 of those are displaced within Syria, and about 80,000 of those are displaced outside of Syria. So for some of those, that will be a third displacement. Some of them will have gone to Syria in 48. Some of them may have gone after 67. Some of them may have gone in the early 70s, but it'll be people who've suffered more than one displacement, some of them, and they're now suffering a second or a third or possibly a fourth displacement. And because they're Palestinian, their flight options are even more restricted than the flight options of Syrians. Now, if you look at the number of Syrians and Palestine refugees in the region, which I think is also quite interesting just because of the scale of it, in Jordan there's now about 600,000 refugees and about 12,000 Palestinians amongst that. We're calling them Palestinians, not Palestine refugees, because it seems about 60 or 70% of them are registered Palestine refugees, and the others are Palestinians who have not until now seen the need to register with us because they had a relatively satisfactory life in Syria. In Lebanon, I think there's almost 1 million refugees. Now, this is in a population of 4.5 million. 60,000 Palestine refugees. Early last year, there were probably more. It's now 60,000. In Egypt, there's about 50,000 and about 5,000 Palestinians. In Turkey, I think almost 1 million, about 1,000 Palestinians. In Gaza, it's hard to believe you would choose to flee to Gaza. There's about 1,000 Palestinians from Syria who have fled to Gaza, and then we understand that there are also non-Palestinians who have fled to Gaza. Now, how they've managed to get in is a bit impenetrable. The treatment of Palestinians fleeing Syria, and that's what we're calling them, and we're calling them Palestinians from Syria, or Palestinian Refugees from Syria, PRS for short. We're being very careful with the nomenclature because the governments don't want the Palestinians. I mean, they already don't want... They've actually, to be fair, they've been very generous and much more generous than Australia would ever be to a major refugee influx. But the Jordanian government at the beginning of 2013 made formal a policy that we already were becoming pretty clear about, which was that Palestinians are not allowed. That policy was made formal and explicit and has remained the policy since January of last year. Palestinians not wanted. Now, Palestinians are still coming in at the rate of about 500 or 600 a month and registering at some point when whatever resources they might have had have vanished. In Lebanon, they have not made a prohibition on Palestinians from Syria. It is slightly more difficult in some administrative ways to get into Lebanon if you're Palestinian than if you're Syrian from Syria. I don't know about the situation in Turkey. We don't have an operation in Turkey, and we're looking at getting additional information at the moment on the situation there. In Egypt, which is a very interesting case because UNRWA doesn't have a mandate in Egypt. It's UNHCR's mandate, but the Egyptian government doesn't want UNHCR to work with the Palestinians. And the Palestinians have had a significantly more difficult time upon arrival in Egypt than other incoming Syrians, and in fact tighter requirements of having a visa before coming in than other refugees from Syria. We've been doing very close cooperation with UNHCR both at field and headquarters to ensure that the 5,000 Palestinians within Egypt can get access to the same sorts of assistance that other refugees from Syria in Egypt are getting, whether it's food vouchers or cash assistance or access to health care. So, but it's quite a complicated venture to do it, and it's where the politics is much more important than the law, because we could have discussions about it's not our mandate, it's UNHCR's mandate, but if the government doesn't want to deal with UNHCR because they're Palestine refugees, therefore ours, then you have to look at alternative and constructive and creative ways to do it. So World Food Programme is doing food vouchers. We're working with the Egyptian Red Crescent to get Palestine refugees access to the same hospital facilities that Syrians are getting through other organisations, and then the cash assistance, we're still looking at how to tidy that up. A lot of the assistance that we're doing in Jordan and Lebanon is cash assistance. It's the easiest and most effective and quickest. and most preserving of dignity sort of solution for refugees who are in need, and it's what's being done for the other refugees, the Syrians. So we're also trying to ensure that what's provided to the Palestinians from Syria and the Syrians from Syria is roughly equivalent, because you don't also want to have problems between the two different population groups. It's an issue that I think we're going to face shortly, if it's not already started to some extent, an issue between the Palestine refugees in Lebanon, we call them PRL, and the Palestinians coming in from Syria, because the Palestinians from Syria are at the moment getting a better cash assistance package. I mean, they've got a much worse deal because they've just fled Syria. But you have to quite carefully manage the relationship between the incoming refugees, the new ones, and the ones who are already there. And the government and UNHCR and UNRWA have to also quite carefully manage the relationship between the population itself and the refugees, new or old, because we wouldn't want to see also a backlash between the existing Palestine refugees in Jordan, the 2 million of them, and the 600,000 extra refugees coming in from Syria. So there's a lot of quite careful work that needs to be done, ensuring that what you're doing in terms of providing humanitarian assistance to those who are suffering the immediate emergency will not adversely affect relationships with the host community. And there's been quite a lot of work in Jordan over the last 6 months in ensuring that some of the package will be providing support to host communities. Part of my role, both in the legal and protection and Director of the Jordan Field Office function, was to try to make sure that the UN community will see Palestine refugees, 2 million of them in a population of 6 million, as part of the host community, entitled to be benefiting from support that goes to the host community for people that they're helping additionally to what their ordinary burden would be. That's, I think, probably enough on the Palestine refugees from Syria in that specific context. I wanted to talk a little bit also about how UNRWA has conceived protection, because we've developed it and strengthened it and given it a structure and some staffing and strategies and policies probably since about 2007. We had a consultant come in 2008 to look at what he thought we should do, somebody with many, many years of UNHCR experience. And it was a very foreign context for him when he arrived, because he was used to protection as UNHCR's protection role is, to be how do you protect refugees from threats that come from the behaviour of governments. And what we wanted to make sure that he included in his thinking was UNRWA is also a service provider. How to make sure that UNRWA, when it's providing services, meets human rights standards and international standards and protection norms in providing our own services. It was quite interesting within UNRWA when we started that work, because you can imagine it wasn't necessarily popular with everybody, that part of what we needed to look at, do we provide education in accordance with international human rights standards? If kids are being the victim of corporal punishment in our schools, which has been a big problem in the region and in our schools, that is not in accordance with UN norms. It has to stop. How do you go about stopping it? So it was an interesting exercise of working out what, in an UNRWA context, should protection look like. I'll come on afterwards to what I see as the sort of principal protection challenges, sort of overall and in our 5 fields of operation. So then, having gone from there's a protection gap, we don't have a protection mandate, to we do have a protection mandate, how should we do protection? Nicholas Morris, ex-UNHCR, looked carefully and spent a couple of months with us in the field and headquarters, interviewing more or less everybody who he thought might have a view on the topic, to try to get to the bottom of what we thought we should be doing. And the model that we came up with, which has, I think, served us quite well for the last medium-term strategy, but I think we need to think about playing with it a little for the next medium-term strategy. So I'll be a bit interested in if people have got views on that afterwards. I might pick your brains. What we decided was that UNRWA has 2 elements of protection, what we call an internal element and an external element. We tried to focus on the internal element as more important because it's the way in which we work. Firstly, the way in which we provide our own services in accordance with human rights and protection standards, and secondly, the way in which we respond to protection threats facing Palestine refugees. The external part of what we saw as our protection role was also twofold. It reminds me of when I was living in Geneva and a French friend told me everything's divided into two and then you can divide it into two again and just keep dividing it into two. So anyway, the external mechanism, the external protection is also divided into two. One being international protection, which is essentially like that which UNHCR does, dealing with protection threats by governments, and not only by governments, also by non-state actors. And then the other one, which is peculiar to our context or a bit different from UNHCR's, is the issue of just and durable solution. So on the international protection, it's looking at what we would do in relation to protection threats against Palestine refugees, whether it's monitoring, reporting, intervening privately, dialogue with the authorities, trying to get other human rights players or other organisations or NGOs interested in the issues and raising them, dealing with the diplomatic community, bringing matters to their attention, dealing with the media, usually a bit as a last resort. What sort of public advocacy would we do on particular issues if none of the other mechanisms had succeeded? The just and durable solutions, it was there because it obviously needs to be there given the situation of Palestinians and that which has been their life for the last 65 years. But it's also a very delicate and usually enormously politically sensitive matter, and it's one that really only the Commissioner General, who's our Chief Executive Officer, intervenes on. So he will raise the importance of a just and durable solution for Palestine refugees, and he will also, and has also, raised the importance of the voice of Palestinian refugees themselves being heard when a just and durable solution is being negotiated, because as we've seen from the last 5 years in the Middle East, it's not been a region traditionally where the wishes of the people were high on the agenda of the government. And I think it's behoves us as an international organisation with a protection role for Palestinian refugees to make sure that Palestinian refugees actually get consulted when deals are being done, should we move towards a political resolution of the situation. A couple of last things I wanted to mention. One, having done quite a lot of work to expand what we do in the field of protection, we then steadily increased over the last few years our relationship with UNHCR to make sure that we're working with one voice on the difference of our roles and why it is that the two of us don't both do exactly the same thing, or sometimes why it is that UNRWA shouldn't just be closed down and Palestine refugees handed to UNHCR, which is another part of discourse which is out there. There's lots of different discourses. We've also, over the last 3 or 4 years, worked a lot on trying to strengthen our relationships with the international human rights system. We felt that it was important, because the situation of Palestine refugees is often politicised. It's quite often useful if advocacy is done by people other than UNRWA. We're a field operation providing and needing to continue to have access to provide humanitarian and human development support in the region. Sometimes it's helpful if we can get messages in or expressed by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, if we can work with some of the special procedures holders, the special rapporteurs on food or water or education or health or adequate standard of living. You can do quite a lot of work on issues like house demolition, the blockade, we can't get building materials to build schools. You can get some things fed into different human rights mechanisms that means we don't then have to raise it in the same way, and maybe it's a different and sometimes a more successful vector for having some influence on government. Then we also work with some of the treaty bodies on children and the situation of women in the region. We try to make sure that they're intelligent questions fed into analysis of individual states' performance in their Universal Periodic Report. So there's a range of ways in which we engage with the international human rights system to make sure that some of the issues on our agenda make it to their agenda, but also to try to use cleverly some of the outputs from the international human rights system, because sometimes if we can refer to something that somebody else has said rather than say something ourselves, it takes the politics out of it and means that we're less likely to damage our own operating space. Last thing I wanted to just quickly run through what I see as the big problems. I mean, in Gaza, it's essentially the blockade and conduct of hostilities when there are hostilities. In the West Bank, it's the West Bank barrier and the associated regime and the consequences that has in terms of forced displacement, access to livelihoods, access to land. In Jordan, it's probably mainly the situation of ex-Gazans and now also the situation of Palestinians from Syria. Lebanon, it's these situations about state not having proper identity, not having access to the labour market, the property market. And in Syria, it's now the total disaster that is the conflagration. I mean, the Yarmouk refugee camp has gone from 120,000 to 18,000 in the space of the last year. Lastly, I just wanted, in case it's of interest to any of you who might be working in the advocacy sphere, I'm only going to take 2 more minutes. One of the things that I've noticed working in this sort of sector, and I used to work with the ICRC previously, if you're wanting to advocate effectively using international law, whether it's human rights law, refugee or international humanitarian law, you want to not be doing too much barrel beating. It wants to be very detailed, sometimes a little bit boring, 100% accurate, and you need to be very clear about what are you trying to change. What is your advocacy objective? Who is best to speak about that objective? Who do you best want to speak to? And what is your message going to be? One of the things that we found, particularly during the Gaza conflict, so end 2008 and beginning 2009, it was often more useful when we were pushing on a particular issue with the Israeli government to talk about the humanitarian situation before using the international legal frameworks. We all know the international legal frameworks, but the humanitarian argument will quite often be a better one. You can sometimes construct it quite cleverly so it's clear that the law is sitting just underneath it, but there's no point in hitting people over the head with the Geneva Conventions. It's sort of quite counterproductive. And I'll stop there if anybody has any questions.
Good. Well, thank you very much. We're very privileged, I think, to hear from an expert on these situations, which I think very few of us have any real access to, at least speaking as somebody based in the United Kingdom, not working in that particular part of the world. It's very rare that we have someone with such expertise coming to speak with a great deal of knowledge on these issues. And I think you've done really well in conveying the complexities of the situation. I mean, the politics is really something that's, I'd certainly like to take a few questions on that if people have them. But it seems immensely complicated. You've got a population which is in the midst of a very difficult political wrangling over a number of decades, and then of course alongside that you have the relations with the governments which are hosting these populations as well. So I think in conveying that complexity in such a short space of time and so simply, you've done really, really well, and I'm sure that there'll be a large number of questions. For those of you who don't know, Anna came specially to talk to you and has literally just stepped off a plane. So to have that degree of coherence in those circumstances, I think, is also very special. Okay, I'll open up for 20 or 30 minutes of questions, and if we could take maybe 2 or 3 questions at once. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I wonder if you could mention the situation of Palestinian refugees in Iraq prior to 2003 and after that, indeed, until current crisis, that there are flow of Palestinian refugees into Iraq, as I am aware.
Good. Palestinian refugees in Iraq. Yes.
Alison Harvey, I was hoping that you could say something about Palestinian statehood and citizenship as per your teaser at the beginning. Very interesting.
Okay. Iraq, statehood, and at the back, third question. Yep.
And I just was wondering if you could shed a bit of clarity onto the situation with the strike. What's happening with regards to the meeting I know is happening, particularly in Gaza, with the unions there, with talks at the end of January, what the outcome of that. And just adding on to that employment side of things, I wasn't sure of UN policy in and the mandate towards employers, the employment of people who have actually been in Israeli detention at some point.
Okay, so the last question for those of you at the front was about employment law in relation to UNRWA's functions, because obviously in some ways it acts a little bit like a state with human rights obligations. There's been a dispute over the last 2 months, so I think the final question was probably speaking to that.
Okay, Palestine refugees in Iraq. I'm not terribly familiar with the situation now. I mean, there was a significant exodus at the time of the conflict, and a lot of them have stayed outside, but some have been going back from Syria. I mean, some have been going from Syria into Iraq in the recent period, and I don't have the numbers, and I think it's another thing that we need to find out, as well as what's happening in Turkey, how many are going back to Iraq, and also how they're being treated within Iraq. But I don't have, I mean, I could get some more information on it, but I don't have that at my fingertips.
Good subject for your next PhD.
Statehood and citizenship. Look, it's a very interesting question. That's why I put it on the table as a teaser, probably. I don't think, I mean, in UN terms, Palestine is now a state. Then the question is, what do you do about citizenship? Now, obviously, that's a question that will have to be decided by the state of Palestine. There have been some discussions about it. There's been some work on what sort of considerations you might look at to determine who should or shouldn't be a Palestinian citizen. I think it needs significant further reflection. The concern that I mean, there were a number of different models being proposed by a number of different players. One of the models that had been proposed was a more automatic grant of citizenship to all ex from Palestine. My concern with that, compared to an approach of people would need to apply if they wanted to apply and would be granted if they met the criteria, was that it could have significant protection concerns for Palestinians, particularly at that stage before the Syria conflict. I was thinking particularly of those living in Lebanon. If they're automatically granted Palestinian citizenship, but they're not necessarily yet able to go back, or where are they going back to, what will that mean for what has been a rather unwelcome welcome in Lebanon? So I think that there needs to be quite a lot of thought into what should be the basis of citizenship. And I think at the same time you would have to think quite carefully, because really it should be the state of Palestine that decides it, and then you would have to decide, it comes back to Palestinian voices being heard. It shouldn't just be the PLO that determines these issues. Who within the Palestinian people will get to have a view on who should get to be a citizen, and who would get to vote first time round to think about who should be a citizen and who should get to vote. I mean, I think the South African model of the first vote, everybody who was there got to vote, is quite an interesting one, and you might have to do something where everybody would get to vote who could establish their links on some original big questions that would need to be determined by the new state of Palestine. Because otherwise I think legitimate voices won't be heard. And that's always a problem, I think, in the Middle East in general, and also in Palestine. On the question of the strike, it was finished on Friday. The strike in Gaza had already been resolved. In fact, there was only a one-day strike in Gaza, so it was a bit of a non-event. Gaza and West Bank are very different employment markets. I mean, if you work for UNRWA in Gaza, particularly under the blockade, you are very conscious. Well, there are two things, I think. You're very conscious that you're lucky to have a job. And I think you're also very conscious that the vast majority of the Gazan population relies on UNRWA, and that you should do your work for the others in the same very difficult environment. The West Bank context is obviously very different from that. The staff will see themselves or wish to compare themselves with perhaps national staff who work in other UN agencies, perhaps with the private sector, and probably not with the Palestinian Authority equivalent teachers and health professionals. Our view has always been, and our pay policy is, that that is the basis for comparison and that we can't move on that. So after a 2-month strike, it started on the 5th of December and it finished last Friday, which is, I think, what, the 7th. They have been back at work properly as of today, with a significant amount of work that's now going to need to be looked at how to make up, particularly for the school children who've lost 9 weeks of school. How are they going to make up those 9 weeks to ensure that at the end of the school year they can sit their school exams and not have missed a year? So that will mean the teachers will be working probably an extra 2 or 3 weeks at the end of the school year, which will be in Ramadan, so it won't be easy either for the children or the teachers. And it will also mean, I think, probably not every Saturday, but probably every second Saturday or something like that, and maybe an extra hour a day, but that's very difficult to manage administratively. On the question of detention, I think it's important to take it away from staff who have been in Israeli detention. We have a detained staff policy which was adopted, I think, in the 1980s, which has been applied ever since. And accepted ever since, both by staff and the union and by management and by the United Nations administrative tribunals. And essentially the position in the detained staff policy is that if a staff member is detained post-conviction for a period of 3 months or more, to be resumed to duty, it will need to be established that the staff member was not at fault. So whether that's imprisonment in Israel or in Palestine, whether Gaza or West Bank or in Jordan or Syria, exactly the same procedures apply, and we do a sort of careful due diligence process after somebody is released after a period of detention of more than 3 months. One of the other things that's important to talk about, I think, in a similar way, and it's a discussion we've had with the unions over the years, people can actually also suffer disciplinary consequences in their work if they have not been found guilty by a local court. Because if you're there, and there are 2 reasons for that. Firstly, the criminal law is a rather narrower range of forms of misconduct than you would expect for a UN employee. And secondly, the burden of proof in a criminal case will be different from the burden of proof in an employment law matter. Just to close the story on employment law, our staff are subject exclusively to the UN's employment rules and regulations, which is why we've created a dispute tribunal so that staff with concerns about the way in which they've been treated, they can first seek a review of the decision if it's an administrative or disciplinary decision, and then if they're not happy with that, they can take their complaint to the UNRWA dispute tribunal, which has an independent judge. And then if they're not happy with the decision of our dispute tribunal, they can appeal to the United Nations Appeals Tribunal. And we pay $9,600 for them to appeal.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a second round of questions. If you've got specific follow-up, we'll leave 5 minutes at the end for some questions on that. So I'd like to try and move the discussion along a little bit. Yes?
First of all, I found it interesting that you used the words left and exodus when you were describing Palestinian refugees, but used the word fleeing when you were describing Syrian refugees. And there's an interesting discourse that surrounds that terminology. But my experience with the West Bank, in particular with NGOs, is that there's been a normalization of the conflict and the occupation. And I was wondering if you see UNRWA in particular as an element, because you describe it as almost like a state actor in facilitating that normalization. And you see that itself as a problem and something in the way of, say, a 2-state or 1-state solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the role of UNRWA in bigger political affairs, yes. Yeah, Katie.
You mentioned that UNRWA is voluntarily funded, and so a large part was by the U.S. State Department. So politically, does that hold any sway in the work UNRWA does?
Okay, lots of political questions. I'm looking for a legal question, but okay. Yes?
Legal questions. I might not be able to answer them.
Fair enough. The sorry.
Excluding people who might be linked to a terrorist organisation and the fact that come out with the social work, and if that causes issues with who you might feel excluded from.
With what, sorry, at the end? Is that causing issues with?
Who you might feel are excluded from your help or protection.
I suppose it's a question about parity again. You can be excluded from refugee status for serious criminality.
Yeah.
Does a similar sort of framework apply for Palestine refugees?
Nicely spotted, the left exodus and fleeing, and it's probably partly because I have given a lot of public talks over many years in Israel, and I've tended to start to use words that won't get me shot down in flames before I even finish a sentence. So that's probably the reason for that. It's not very nicely even-handed, as you note, but that's probably the reason for it. The question of what UNRWA does and what its influence is in a 2 or a 1 or a no or a 3 or a many-state solution, it's a very political question. It's one we tend to avoid. One of the things that happens is we get very different criticisms from very different parts of the political landscape. I mean, I have been equally strongly attacked by a young Palestinian filmmaker in a Tel Aviv cafe and an Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs interlocutor for exactly the same reason, which was, I don't personally believe it, but the argument is that UNRWA perpetuates the refugee problem, and there wouldn't be a refugee problem if it wasn't for UNRWA. Now, obviously, the MFA interlocutor and the Palestinian filmmaker had very different notions about how things might play out if UNRWA didn't exist, but they still saw UNRWA as a barrier to things being different. It's very awkward to know how to relate to that question. It's one of the things that, as a human rights lawyer, it's a bit like some of the discussions I would have with people when I was at the ICRC. You know, if the ICRC wasn't doing protection, if the ICRC wasn't providing assistance, maybe the wars wouldn't go on. I mean, they're all slightly awkward what-if discussions, and at the end of the day, from my perspective as an UNRWA employee and director of the legal department, is our mandate is to do what the international community has told us to do through General Assembly resolutions, and that's what we do. And personally, I like to see Palestinians getting something during this period that's now gone on for 65 years, because the notion that Palestinian kids in Lebanon wouldn't be able to get an education at all because the Lebanese government wouldn't have them in the schools, that doesn't sit well with me. That's a slightly long-winded answer. The next two questions in some ways are linked, or they're possibly linked in my mind, because they are of key concern not just to the US but to donors generally. I'll deal with the more specific issue about terrorism first, and then I'll come to the larger question about, do donors have political sway over humanitarian actors? On the question about terrorism, the UN has quite specific obligations in relation to terrorism. We need to ensure that we don't provide money to terrorists or terrorist organisations. We need to ensure the neutrality of our installations, staff, beneficiaries, and interlocutors. We need to do that because we're the United Nations and it fits with general UN principles. We need also to do it because donors expect us not to be providing money to terrorists or terrorist organisations. there are in our framework agreements with most of the governments who give us large amounts of money, we enter into a framework agreement. If we're really lucky, it's a 3-year framework. If we're not, it's a 1-year framework, and sometimes it's twice a year. So in our framework agreements with Canada, Australia and the United States, there are explicit provisions which deal with this issue about money not going to terrorists. Our line has always been, we do more than you want us to do, and not because you want us to do it, but because we're the United Nations and our money should be going to those who most need it, which will be those who are civilians, who are not terrorists. Now, that's obviously in an organisation where you're providing humanitarian services. It's obviously more nuanced than that, because obviously a child goes to an UNRWA school and can go to an UNRWA school irrespective of what his mother or father may or may not have done. So there's universal access to UNRWA schools. Same for healthcare. I mean, there's universal access to UNRWA's healthcare. So it would cut in only around the edges of UNRWA's service delivery. In terms of the US having political sway, I don't think the US as a government has political sway over UNRWA. UNRWA has an advisory commission which was established when we were first set up, which was about 15 governments when we were first set up, and I think it's 22 or something now. It's now become nicely commercialised, and we've expanded it to include those who give more than $5 million a year. It's like getting citizenship. So the advisory commission, it's not like an executive board, it's not a decision-making authority, it's not the executive or governance body of UNRWA, but it exists to provide advice to UNRWA on our medium-term strategy and on big political or... For example, at the moment there have been discussions for some years, should we keep the microfinance operation or should we spin it off to a private sector but retaining public objectives, organisation. If we were to decide to do that, we'd need to get the Advisory Commission to take a view on it. The US and England and all the likely suspects and the host governments are there in that Advisory Commission, so they would all have a role in that. I suppose that's my answer to that question.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, some good questions so far. Further questions, comments? Yes, sorry, yeah.
It's about the definition of the Palestinian refugee. We have the operational definition and the legal definition. How can that tension be not resolved, but at least explained under the current circumstances in which the conflicts in the Middle East are getting more and more, the dynamics of the conflicts are making more tense those two spheres of definition of the Palestinian refugee?
Mm-hmm.
Good. A legal question. Thank you very much. Political questions and legal ones equally welcome, I should have said. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I have a refugee question after a little bit of introduction, if you don't mind. Anna knows we met before, which was grand. I'm Neil Salmons from Amnesty International, and I'm working particularly on Syria, and during the last few years, amongst other things, I've had the pleasure of meeting many Palestinian refugees from Syria in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, Kurdistan, and I'm just writing a report now, trying to anyway, on the siege of Yarmouk in southern Damascus. But my question is to do with, I guess, the extra displacement which Palestinians from Syria are going through, and actually are trying to go through, some of them, to reach outside the region, and the extent to which there may be advocacy going on so that Palestinian refugees from Syria are included or even promoted or prioritised to be amongst those deserving of resettlement or come under humanitarian assistance programmes, whether Europe or the rest of the world.
Okay, thanks. So a question fundamentally about resettlements through UNHCR mandates or through some other mandate system?
Okie dokie. There isn't really a legal definition. We only have this operational definition. The General Assembly never sat down and never wanted to sit down to do a legal definition. My guess is because trying to have that discussion with 180 member states, well, more now, 200, would be a total disaster, and you wouldn't get any agreement on it. So I think what we have is the operational definition that's all it is. But I think it has a legal importance, and I think if and when there's a settlement of the situation of Palestine refugees, I think that operational definition is going to be crucial in terms of right of return, compensation, because our registration records are also going to be crucial. I mean, I think it will be interesting to see if at some point there's a confidence that current negotiations could lead to outcomes. Would we potentially see an increase in registration by those who until now have chosen not to register? And I think that's on the citizenship question. I think if there were ever a settlement to this question, I think what would happen with compensation and how it would be managed, whether it would be individual or group, who it would go to, would it just end up in somebody's coffers and then disappear? I think there would be quite a lot of quite interesting questions also to be looked at about compensation if there were ever a solution. On the displacement, it's been one of those extremely complex questions politically. What we have hoped is, and the way in which we've described it, a bit like the way we have described it as for Palestinians coming out of Syria. There should be equal treatment and they shouldn't be discriminated against. So in the same way that Syrians from Syria are able to come into Jordan, Palestinians from Syria should be able to come into Jordan, and that would be also our view in relation to Palestinians from Syria who are wishing to be resettled elsewhere, that they shouldn't be excluded from resettlement possibilities because they're Palestinian. Now, the politics of the right of return intersecting with that means that it's not something that the Palestinian government is necessarily going to be able to push on. And it's another question that I think is interesting about Palestinian statehood and the state of Palestine's obligation as a state to be carrying out protection on behalf of its not yet quite citizens, because we haven't worked out who would be a citizen. So my view is that they shouldn't be precluded from resettlement. And when you look at the countries that have already made some resettlement commitments, a number of them have explicitly said that Palestinians wouldn't be excluded from those resettlement commitments. But I mean, to be frank, when you look at how many people have been taken in by the region, where it's, over 2 million probably within the region, the offers that are on the table from Europe, and the States and Australia and other places are not as yet very generous or going to make a significant difference.
Okay, I'm conscious that your voice is running out, so perhaps just one more question. Okay, 2 more very quick questions in that case. Yeah, Pat.
How does one access the records of UNRWA, and specifically in connection with Jenin refugee camp? I need to treat trace family members.
Okay, unless it's of more general interest, you might want to just have a word afterwards, if that's okay. Yeah.
I was wondering how and if UNRWA work with the Arab League.
Okay. Politics question.
We do work with the Arab League. We've partly tried to be strengthening our fundraising. About 5 years ago, we recruited a former British diplomat who had been for many years, I think, based in Egypt as ambassador and who speaks fluent Arabic. But we've also tried to work with the Arab League. I mean, we have also been trying to see from a protection perspective, and I mean, we're not the only ones. Bits of the UN system and bits of the Red Cross system and different bits of different systems are trying to see what some of the Arab states and the Arab League can do in relation to both what is going on in Syria, because I think there's been a tendency over the last couple of years to focus only on the humanitarian situation of those who've managed to get out of Syria. So I think we're trying to keep some pressure on so that the human rights and international humanitarian law obligations for those still within Syria are not forgotten. but also whether some of the Arab states could have some purchase on some of the governments which are unwilling to take in refugees or which are unwilling to take in Palestinians in particular. So it's a dual potential political influence and potential fundraising.
Good. Well, listen, thank you very, very much. Firstly for the questions, and secondly for the answers and for the talk itself. So I hope you'll join me in thanking again our speaker for this evening, Anne. Thanks very much.